My name is Maya Kessler. I'm 29, and this July, for the first time in 26 years, my family spent our annual beach week without me. Something about "wasn't really room" struck me as a strange thing to say about a beach condo my family has owned outright since before I was born. 3 weeks later, I understood exactly why that sentence had sounded wrong, and what my family had actually been trying to accomplish that week, quietly, while I sat 2,000 miles away, wondering why nobody wanted me there. Welcome back to Sweet Payback Stories, where the ones left off the group chat finally get the last word. If you've ever found out you were excluded from something before you understood why, stay with me. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from, and subscribe because this story does not end on that beach. Let me take you back to where that condo came from, and why no room never should have made sense. My grandfather, Walter Kessler, bought a 2-bedroom condo in a small beachfront community called Driftwood Cove back in 1975, the same year my father was born, and spent the next 40 years of his life turning 1 week every July into the fixed point our entire extended family orbited around. He put the property into a family trust decades before he died. Specifically, he used to say, so that no single person could ever decide to sell the only thing that gets all of you in one room together. Growing up, that week was the closest thing my family had to a religion. The same sunburns, the same crab boil on the porch, the same argument about whose turn it was to do dishes, every single July. Walter died 6 years ago, when I was 23, and my parents took over managing the trust's practical affairs, since he'd never fully explained to any of us grandchildren exactly how the legal structure worked, only that it belonged to the family. In the loose, comforting way families describe things they've never actually read the paperwork on. I want to be honest about the shape of my family before I explain what happened this July, because it matters to understanding how something like this could happen without anyone screaming about it first. My older sister Brooke married young, had 2 kids by 28, and settled 45 minutes from our parents. I moved to Denver for a marketing job 6 years ago. Single, no kids, building a career that my parents have never quite known how to talk about at dinner. The imbalance has always been there in small ways. Brooke's kids get the bigger presents, the longer visits, the assumption of priority when scheduling matters. I told myself, the way you tell yourself things that let you keep showing up, that it was just the natural gravity of grandchildren, nothing personal. This July made it personal in a way I couldn't explain away anymore. After that first phone call with my mother, I did something I'd never had reason to do before. I called Driftwood Cove's property management office, directly, ostensibly to ask about unit availability for a future trip, mostly because some instinct told me there wasn't really room deserved actual verification, rather than my mother's word alone. The woman on the phone was kind and a little confused by my question, since our family's unit isn't a rental. It's owner-occupied, always has been. She pulled up the file to confirm the reservation dates for me, and mentioned, almost as an aside, that the owner of record listed on this year's paperwork had recently been updated. Not Walter Kessler, deceased. Not my parents, Brooke Kessler Hart. I sat with that detail for 2 days before I mentioned it to anyone, because I needed to understand it before I let myself react to it. I called my cousin Devin, who'd posted the photo that started all of this, and asked, casually, if he knew anything about paperwork changes at the condo. He said he'd overheard my parents mention, during the trip, "We're finally getting Grandpa's old paperwork sorted out properly." Language vague enough to mean almost anything, and specific enough to tell me this hadn't been an accident of scheduling. Something administrative had been happening at that property, on that exact week, and I hadn't been invited to be anywhere near it while it happened. I still had some of my grandfather's old papers, boxes I'd taken home after helping clean out his house 4 years ago, mostly out of sentiment rather than any expectation I'd need them for anything. The same box, I found something I hadn't known existed. A sealed envelope with my name on it in my grandfather's handwriting, postmarked the spring. I finished college 6 years ago, the same month I'd moved out of my childhood bedroom for the last time. It had clearly been opened at some point, then apparently set aside and forgotten in a box of my things my parents had been holding on to, never handed to me directly. Inside was a letter from Walter, along with a notarized amendment to the original trust. The letter was short. In the plain, unsentimental way my grandfather wrote everything. He said he was naming me, specifically, as successor trustee once he was gone, not my parents, because, in his words, you're the one who asks the second question instead of just accepting the first answer, and this family is going to need that eventually. The amendment attached to the letter formalized it. Maya Kessler, named sole successor trustee, effective upon his death. I sat on my apartment floor in Denver with that letter for a long time. 6 years. My grandfather had died believing I understood a responsibility he deliberately handed to me, and I had spent those 6 years with no idea it existed, because a letter meant to reach me at exactly the right moment had instead landed in a box that took me 6 years and one deeply strange phone call to think to open. I hired an estate attorney, a man named Curtis Meyer, who specializes in trust disputes, mostly because I no longer trusted my own read of legal documents enough to act on it alone. He confirmed within a week what I'd hoped and feared in equal measure. The amendment was valid, properly notarized, and had in fact been recorded with the county the same year my grandfather signed it. Legally, for the past 6 years, I had been the trustee of Driftwood Cove's ownership trust, whether or not anyone, including me, Curtis's next question was the one that turned this from a strange family mystery into something with real legal weight. If I'd held trustee authority for 6 years without exercising it, what exactly had my parents been doing in that role instead, and under what authority? We requested the trust's full administrative history from the county recorder's office and the property management company. What came back showed 6 years of decisions, property tax payments, insurance renewals, minor repairs, made by my parents acting as if they still held trustee authority, decisions that, Curtis explained carefully, weren't necessarily illegal in themselves, since nobody had challenged them and no harm had come from routine maintenance being handled. But the very last document in that file was different. A deed transfer application, submitted 3 weeks ago, the same week of the family trip, requesting that ownership of the Driftwood Cove unit be moved fully into Brooke's name. That was the week. That was the whole reason. My family hadn't excluded me from a beach vacation. They'd excluded me from a property transfer meeting, scheduled with a local real estate attorney during the 1 week of the year. The whole family was already gathered there anyway, timed so that the one person who might have questions about it, the one person who, unbeknownst to any of them, actually held the legal authority to stop it, would be 2,000 miles away, assuming she'd simply been forgotten. I called my mother again, calmer this time, because I needed information more than I needed to be right in the moment. I asked her directly whether she'd known about Grandpa's amendment, naming me trustee. She said, after a pause too long to be nothing, that she remembered a letter arriving for me around the time I graduated, that she'd meant to give it to me, that things had been chaotic that spring with my own grandfather's declining health, and that she genuinely didn't remember, until I said it out loud, what had ultimately happened to it. I don't know, even now, whether that's entirely true. I know that whatever happened to that letter, 6 years of decisions had proceeded afterward as though it never existed, which served my parents' management of the property considerably more conveniently than it served me. I asked her directly about the deed transfer. This time there was no confusion in her answer, only a kind of tired honesty I hadn't expected yet. She said Brooke and her husband had been struggling to qualify for a mortgage on a bigger house for the kids, and that she and my father had decided, quietly, over the past year, that transferring the beach condo fully into Brooke's name would let Brooke's family use it as collateral, or eventually sell it if they needed to, since, in my mother's words, you don't really need it the way she does. You're building your own life out there. I understood, hearing that this wasn't cruelty for its own sake. It was a financial rescue plan for one daughter, built quietly on an asset that had never fully belonged to my parents to redirect in the first place, executed during a week deliberately arranged so the person with actual legal standing to object wouldn't be in the room to ask the obvious question. What about the rest of the family Grandpa built this for? The deed transfer was still pending when I found all of this, not yet finalized, which Curtis told me was the one piece of good news in an otherwise upsetting timeline. As trustee, I had standing to formally halt it, and we did, through a letter to the title company and the real estate attorney handling the closing, informing them that the individual who'd authorized the transfer request lacked the legal authority to do so, and that the actual trustee, me, had not approved it, and did not intend to. The closing attorney's office froze the transfer within 2 days, a quiet administrative stop, no courtroom, no drama, just a paper trail correcting itself once the right person was finally in the loop. I want to be clear that I didn't do this to punish Brooke, or even really to punish my parents. I did it because a document my grandfather had deliberately written, 6 years before any of this happened, still meant something to me, even 6 years late, and I wasn't willing to let it get quietly overwritten by a decision made in a room I'd been specifically kept out of. Brooke called me 2 days after the transfer froze, and I could tell from her voice she hadn't known the full mechanics of any of it. Not the trustee amendment, not the letter that never reached me, only that Mom and Dad had told her the condo was finally being sorted out for the family, and that it made sense for her name to be on it, given her situation. Cried, apologizing for something she said she hadn't fully understood she was part of, and I believed her, mostly because the version of events she described matched the pattern I'd already seen in my parents. Information managed carefully, room by room, so that no single person ever had the full picture at once. The confrontation with my parents happened over a video call, all three of us, Curtis's letter open on my laptop screen in front of me, and it wasn't the dramatic reckoning I might have wanted years earlier. My father said very little, the way he usually does. My mother cried at one point, not performatively, I think, but out of the specific exhaustion of watching a plan meant to help one child quietly cost her the trust of the other. She apologized for the transfer, less clearly for the letter, and I let both apologies sit without deciding, that day, exactly how much of either one I believed. What we built afterward, over the following month, mattered more to me than the apology did. As the properly confirmed trustee, with Curtis's help, I formalized a rotating usage schedule, honoring what my grandfather's original trust had actually said: equal access for all descendants. No single branch of the family holding disproportionate claim. Ownership remaining with the trust itself, rather than any one person's name. Exactly the structure Walter had built in the first place, specifically so no one could quietly redirect it later. I made sure Brooke's family kept their usual July week. I also made sure any future changes to that structure would require my sign-off, not because I don't trust my family, but because I just learned, expensively, what happens when nobody with real authority is paying attention. I went back to Driftwood Cove myself 2 months later. For a week I scheduled deliberately outside the family's usual July slot, mostly because I needed to stand on that porch without an audience and figure out how I actually felt about all of it. I sat in the same chair my grandfather used to sit in every evening, and I thought about a letter that had waited 6 years in a box to tell me something he'd trusted me to eventually understand on my own. It had taken longer than he probably hoped. I don't think it had taken too long. My relationship with my parents is smaller now, quieter, still mending in the slow, uneven way these things mend. Brooke and I talk more honestly than we used to, now that neither of us is being managed around the other. I still go to the July beach week. I go now, though, as the person actually responsible for making sure that week keeps existing the way my grandfather intended it to. For all of us equally, whether or not anyone remembers to book my room. That's my story. One missing reservation, one letter that took 6 years to finally reach me, and a trust document that had been telling the truth the whole time, waiting for someone to open the right box. If your family has ever managed information around you instead of with you, take that as your sign. Ask the second question. Read the paperwork yourself. Thank you for watching Sweet Payback Stories. Drop a comment, hit subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.